Welcome back. We will start with lecture 4 today. This is module 3 lecture 4. In this lecture we will look at another kind of variation, which is we can call it performance based variation of language, within which we will talk about narratives and genres. So, genres of various kinds, spoken, written, all of them are part of the broader category of genres. So, narratives and genre and then their analysis system is what we will discuss today. In a broad way, we can define narrative and genre in this way. Narrative is a story shaped discourse organizing experience, constructing identity and communicating events in a structured way. Basically, narrative is a story of any kind. It can be your personal experience, it can be about something else, it can be stories in different ways. So, basically a story, basically a structured anything that is expressed in a structured way, from personal experience to even news reports, they all are narratives. So, that is narrative. Narrative is the broader identity, within which you can have different types. Now, genre talks about the types. So, you can create different kinds of narratives and each of them will be a part of a genre. So, there can be different kinds of genres like folk tales can be one, myth can be another, legends on the one hand, and on the other hand you can even have things like news report, you can have sermon, jokes, they all are part of different kinds of genre. So, that is genre basically means the socially recognized discourse category. So, while a narrative is about story that represents any kind of an experience or anything, genre talks about the category of that story. So, key distinction that some scholars have made is narratives are dynamic, context sensitive sequence serving social and identity functions, emphasize what is told, what is it that it is all about, that is typically what narrative is all about. So, what is the story, what is told and its relation to social experience. On the other hand, genres will talk about abstract text categories defined by conventional structures. So, depending on the structure, a kind of a narrative will be either belong to genre 1 or genre 2, like that. So, the genres typically will have a particular structure, each genre will have its own structure. This is nothing new, this kind of studies, this kind of analysis has a it goes back a long way. This goes back to Aristotle's times, when in Aristotle's Poetics, where he classified writing into different kinds. So, different kinds as in poetry, drama and epic. So, during Aristotle's time also discussing about narratives and their forms was popular. So, he defined genres of tragedy, comedy and epic as distinct kinds of language, and that is why we are discussing this. So, because each of these different types of narratives will employ a different kinds of linguistic structure, right. So, within linguistic anthropology or ethnographic account of language, that is what we are discussing in this course. We have many scholars like Prof. Boa, Duranty and many other scholars. They have this domain started with comparative analysis of folk literature across the world, in many places across the world. Their study on folk narratives and their performances brought it within the domain of linguistics, linguistics from the social perspective. In the modern times, in the modern evolution, we name that that has a lot to do with this domain is that of Mikhail Bakhtin. His work he further contributed to introducing speech genres as a stable utterance type. So, in the older times we have the Prof. Boa, Duranty and others, Hymes as well, who worked on this. In the modern times we have the main name that comes across, of course, is that of Bakhtin, and many other scholars have also looked at it. And the notion also has changed. So, earlier studies looked at folk narratives of different kinds, differentiating between historical tales and folk and myths and legends and so on. In today's time, we have narratives also include popular various kinds of popular cultural forms like soap operas, westerns and film noir and various other kinds. So, the domain of study has become much wider. It has incorporated a lot of newer types as well. So, we will look at some of these scholars a little as to what they contributed and how the field came to be. Russian folklorist Vladimir Prop is one of the most well known names in this domain. His book, his famous book, The Morphology of the Folk Tale, this was based on the Russian folk tales. So, he collected folk tales from various parts of Russia and he started to analyze them. The point of analysis was, even though the folk tales had different kinds of stories, according to him, there was some amount of similarity across different kinds of narratives. So, he was trying to look at if they can be understood, they can be categorized in terms of the structural properties, right. So, he explained that actions and characters worked in limited ways, even when the number of stories are numerous, there are lots of stories, different kinds of stories, but the characters and the actions has a particular format. So, the witch in one story, the villain in another story has a particular way of behaving. So, the actor action sequence, actor action pair had a particular structural way of behavior in across the different kinds of stories. So, that is what he looked at. So, in other words, he brought out the discernible and repeated patterns within folk tales using symbolic logic and morphological analysis, and he has been very influential in among the other scholars in this domain. Many later scholars followed his methodology. So, he offers his analysis of fairy tale morphology as the basis of a hypothetical definition of the genre. So, he used his analysis, came up with the morphological patterning and thereby gave a definition as to how genres could be defined. Within linguistic anthropology, it is a sister domain. So, folklore, the domain of folklore and the domain of linguistic anthropology are sister domains. So, whatever happens in one domain will affect another. In the linguistic anthropology domain, the role of genre within this bigger domain goes back to Boas' time. So, Boas and his followers, so Franz Boas and his followers. His anthropological studies were primarily rooted in philological foundation because he was carrying out analysis, comparative analysis of Native American text and verbal art. So, across many Native American communities, he was looking at the folk narratives of various types and doing a comparative analysis. That is why we say that there is a philological foundation to it. And as a result, because he was looking at so many different kinds, so naturally to define the genre became an important and integral part of his work. So, he is as a result of which discrimination among orders of text was at times seen to be a necessary task, at least for certain purposes, because that is what he was dealing with. So, grouping the tasks into various kinds under the heads of myth, custom, letters, non-mythical narratives and supplementary upper Chinookan text is a case in point. That is how the initial categorization happened, because he was collecting all these texts from various kinds of Native American groups, and this is so myth, non-myth, within the non-myth many others, within the myth many other kinds. So, that is how it went. Later, the influence of Mikhail Bakhtin, that was what we mentioned in the beginning, on genre as a compositional organizing principle of utterances has given further prominence to the concept of genre in this particular domain. So, going back all the way to Franz Boas and his work to all the way to Mikhail Bakhtin, each of them had their own way of own influence. Delheims is another important name here. So, Delheims in his 1967 article titled Models of Interaction of Language and Social Settings brings in this idea of genre, and then he tries to also he gives his own ideas about genre as to what it is and how it should be dealt with within the broader domain of ethnography of speaking. Ethnography of speaking is something that Delheims is he is the one who created this entire domain. So, within that he brought it in. So, how does he understood genre? As a category or type of speech or event a nexus of interrelationships among components of the speech event and a formal vantage point on speaking practice. So, he included both speech act and event within this, and also the interrelationship among components of the speech event. So, try to give some sort of a his position on genre as to what he thinks the genre should be. In his later works, most importantly Ways of Speaking, he sets out to propose that all speech has some form of formal characteristic feature of a genre. So, it is tempting to generalize the category of genre, so that all verbal material is assignable to some genre. That is how he proposed in 1974. Basically, different kinds of speaking also have their own structure. So, basis that you can always say that every kind of speaking will automatically fall within one category. Now, going back to Boas' work, his work brought out the utility of studying generic categories in different ways. Though he sometimes, some later scholars have said that he was sort of ambivalent, but certain things are clear, they are less than ambiguous. So, on the one hand, he suggested the need to record the full array of verbal genres because of their varying stylistic peculiarities. So, on the one hand, he was of the opinion that understanding genre or studying them, analyzing them is important, because to understand the verbal peculiarities. On the other hand, if he also said that the presence, either the presence or absence of particular verbal genres in culture's repertoire may serve as a means of testing universalist theories on origin and development of literature. So, universalist theory might posit that every language, every culture, every cultural repertoire will have certain kinds of genres. So, if you are working on that, if you are collecting adequate information and analysis, then it will help you either understand, either support or debunk the universalist theory. So, that is another way he thought generic understanding or genre analysis will be useful. Now, while scholars are busy, were busy analyzing genres in terms of various kinds of methods. So, starting with Propp, who popularized the idea of morphological analysis or other kinds of analysis, as we will see, they always had this, they always were faced with the idea that the scholarly way of understanding genre may or may not, may or may not be the similar as the community does think about it. So, the community may think of the genres in a different way as opposed to the scholarly way. So, that is something that all the scholars have in this domain, all the scholars have at least in passing mentioned. Some of them have worked on it in more detail, some have mentioned. So, the division of the genre basically may not always be what they say is that clear cut across groups. So, not only the groups, the ethnic groups may have their own way of genre differentiation from the scholars, but across communities also the differentiation might not have the same kind. So, one community might consider a particular type of story as historical tale, another community might consider the same type of tales as myth. That is what they meant. So, one group might categorize a type of narrative in one class, and the same type of narrative might be classified into a different class by a different or even a neighboring group. So, initial groupings were primarily of these two types, the myth versus historical tales. So, myth is something that is beyond time, beyond when anybody knew what happened. Those stories were categorized as myth. On the other hand, historical tales are something that there were witnesses and there were people who saw that happening. So, this is broadly the division that worked for most of the scholars who were working on these different kinds of ethnic groups. Now, in other words, but in case of communities, in some of these differentiation may not really work. So, how you can understand it in different words, the community themselves have a set of principles for categories or genres. So, if one community understands a certain story as myth, the same story can be understood as historical tale by a different group. That is something that we are talking about. So, as a result of which this is a domain where linguistics and cultural pattern come together, in fact, in a very strong way. So, he has often highlighted, Boa has often highlighted the distinction between myth and historical tales as being perfectly clear in the mind of the Indian. It is not like the Indian here refers to the native Indian, Native American Indian. So, these people, they do understand what they are talking about. It is not that they have a very vague idea. No, he stresses this point again and again, that the Indians do have a very clear cut idea what they will call myth and what they will call historical tale. Many other scholars, his own students and others, have followed in his footsteps. So, one of them is Paul Radin. He carried forward the tradition. His most important contribution by him was creating a different third category. The two most important categories, as we just saw, were myth and historical tale. Now, he talks about, based on his study on the Winnebago mythology, he mentions a third type, which is myth tale, because in some communities the distinction may not be like the way Boa looked at it. They might be having some different category, which he called a mixed category, and he gave it a name. And so, his work hinted that categorizing basis of the genres might depend on situational and strategic factors. We will see that other scholars have also encountered this. So, the same kind of narrative may be understood differently given the setup, given the situation where it is performed, where it is used, and so on. So, that is something that Paul Radin was one of the first to talk about. Outside the tradition of Boa and his followers, there was another great scholar, Thomas Sebeok. He also worked on this. So, the structural definition of oral genes is what he looked at, and he basically cites stylistic analysis of folklore texts of Boa and others, and positions himself more towards props work. So, he does refer to Boa and his followers, but then he positions himself as closer to props methodology, because he also is looking at the morphological analysis of the folklores. So, in his classic, this is again a classic work, The Structure and Content of Jeremy's Charms. He looked at the charms of this community and considered this the charms also as a genre. So, we have myth, we have historical tale, we have myth tale, now we have charms also. This is also understood to be a different kind of genre. Now, another important contribution of Sebeok is that he noticed that though charms can be considered a category, that is another genre within the folk narratives, this is there are some unique features about them which sometimes gives them peculiarity and concreteness, by which he means that charms, though there is some amount of general structure, but some of them have also individual characteristics. So, depending on the situation, depending on various other factors, they can have an individual character. So, it needs to be understood both from general as well as from individual perspective. And within text, he talks about employing a binary opposition as a patterning principle. So, because he is looking at, he is also utilizing props methodology. So, he has this binary opposition, binary patterning principle. So, and he talks about it in this way: we shall repeatedly divide sequences dichotomously until the final ultimate constituents are reached. So, from sections to sentences to clauses to action, actor or actor action phrases and so on. So, constantly dividing it into smaller components and thereby trying to see the pattern. Though he used not only morphology, he also used phonological, syllabic and syntactic structure in analysis. Morphology remained his most important, they defined his structural analysis, because as we said, he was following props methodology. Another name in this domain is that of Alan Dundes. He followed prop again in considering morphological structure as central to genre analysis. His most famous work is the Morphology of North American Indian Folk Tales. As you notice that most of these scholars were working on North American, Native American folk tales. So, morphology, he also considered it the locus of invariance. Locus of invariance as in something that does not change. The story may change, many things might change, but the morphological structure will remain unchanged, and hence that is used as a variable which to decide as to which genre something belongs. And based on these, he noted that myth and folk tale are not distinct genres. So, we started with Boa, who considered myth and historical tales differently. Here he says that myth and folk tale are not distinct genres. Only the content or external factors like belief are the variance because between these two. Many other scholars, following the Propp's style, many other scholars have looked at speech forms and their genres as well. So, Gary, two names that we will be discussing is that of Gary Goosen and Brian Strauss, who looked at specifically at the speech forms. So, they discussed in certain communities like the Chamula people of Highland Chiapas, that is what Goosen worked in. He finds that genre is locally constituted. So, depending on the way the community understands, that is how the genre will be understood by them. So, he employs structural semantic analytical technique of ethnoscience, and he found out that there is a taxonomic organization of the speech forms of these people. So, taxonomic organization as in there is a hierarchical organization of the speech forms from the most formal to the most everyday. So, everyday to the highly dense formal structure, the community itself has an understanding of which is which. That is what he meant by when he said that it is locally constituted within the community by the community. So, the factors, so what are the factors that decides which is formal and which is not? So, there are multiple things that he found out. So, formal, functional, situational, social organizational, ethical, cosmological principle, all kinds of principles are there based on which they have this taxonomical organization of the types of speech forms. Brian Strauss presents his analysis on a different community, it is the Tzeltal community, which is a neighboring language and a neighboring community, both are Mayan language, but this language and this community has a slightly different way of understanding the same kind of taxonomy. So, here they had 4 types. Here in the Tzeltal community, he finds that though there are some similarities, so there are some similarities with the taxonomic labels, but what he also finds is that there are more metalinguistic terms in this language which are used for defining the genre of speech in this particular community. And in the end, he in fact, many later scholars have said that he found out 400 few such metalinguistic principles and metalinguistic terms, and probably he then gave up. So, there were so many different ways of understanding this. So, the Tzeltal domain of speaking is in fact an open system with fuzzy boundaries, because there are so many different ways of looking at it. As such, it is highly adaptable to change in the social environment and must be constantly evolving, must be seen as constantly evolving. So, these are neighboring communities, but even then the speech forms, even though there is a structure, there is a taxonomic hierarchy, but even then there are so many other variables that also play a part and the community understands it. So, it is constantly evolving with fuzzy boundaries, that is what he thought. Similarly, other scholars have also looked at genres as performance. So, depending on, even if the text, even if the narrative is kind of same, but depending on where it is performed, it will be considered a different genre. So, that is what genre as a performance talks about. So, there are interesting studies, for example, the particular study on San Bias Kuna culture, he talks about the particular kind of a narrative called Ikarkana or curing texts. So, these texts are same, but these can be used in various contexts. So, he talks about all these kinds of contexts. So, primary magical use. So, because this is a curing text, so primary usage of this text is for magical cure, magical purposes. But at the same time, there are so many others. So, disease prevention, improving abilities, general control of the spirit world, to the rehearsal of an Ikar by specialists, the teaching, learning of Ikar, and n number of other possibilities. So, the Ikarkana or the curing text is a text. Now, the performance of that text differs depending on the context depending on where it is. So, it can be used as a magical text, it can be used as a teaching material, it can be used for curing, for disease prevention and so on and so forth. So, as a result of which it with the performance will decide the genre. Similarly, Alessandro Duranti also explores the formally and functionally contrastive usage of the Samoan genre of oratory called Lauga. The community also has a particular form, a particular genre of oratory which has a particular name. Now, this also can be utilized for both in ceremonial events and in a type of political meeting called phono. Now, depending on where it is used, it will follow within the category of a different genre. So, basically both Scharzer's and Duranti's analysis established that the generic specification of the Ikar or the Loga, whatever depending on the community, it cannot be accomplished by the examination of text alone. So, if we follow the tradition of Propp of using morphological analysis and all the followers of him, even Boa for that matter, they were focusing on the text. Now, other studies have pointed out that it is not just the text, but the performance of the text, where it is used, who are the people and how they look at it, all of these are also important variables to understand what is. So, the relationship between genre and event becomes a very crucial parameter as well. Then later we have narrative schema model of Lebov and Rilsky. They developed this schema model in 1967 mainly to analyze the oral narratives of personal experiences. So, this model was developed based on a study on Hispanic and African American communities in New York. They wanted to test the hypothesis whether the language used by marginalized groups had any limitation, and thereby they had collected a lot of information, they had gone around interviewing participants, and they created a schematic understanding to analyze the number of all of these all the genres, all the narratives that they collected. They used a schema to understand them, and that same schema, narrative schema, was later used for a number of literary narratives such as novel, short story, and even applications in media studies and creative writing. So, Lebov and Walensky's narrative schema has been rather influential. So, approach that brings us to the approaches to narrative analysis. So, we have already seen some starting with Boa and then Propp and many others, and then of course, Lebov. So, if you look at all of this, there are particularly two kinds of analysis. One is componential analysis and then there is functional analysis. Componential analysis is when you are looking at the elements of the narrative rather than the usage of it. So, elements in terms of structural elements, maybe morphology, maybe some other kinds of structural element, and based on that you understand the genre of whatever kind. Functional analysis on the other hand examines the purpose of narrative, that is what we saw with Duranti and others. Similar differences can be also cited from the modern day studies of narratives and genres. So, here we are looking at what narratives describe and what they accomplish are completely different things. So, what is there in the text and why do we use that text, why do we say this, why do we what is the purpose of that text are different things. So, we are looking at the function of it, just like we have the others have also talked about. So, componential analysis was carried out by Lebov and Walensky, as I said, and this is how they the central aim of this approach is to identify the basic structure of a narrative by examining the sequence of clauses. So, that is how they looked at it, and what are the clauses? These are some of the clauses that they have talked about: free clauses, coordinate clauses, restricted clauses and narrative clauses. These are well known structures today. We use these to understand narratives. This goes back to Lebov's work in all the way to 1967. And so, these are the 6 functions of narrative that they talked about. So, abstract, coda, resolution, orientation and complication and evaluation. So, this is the structure with which you can utilize, this is the structure that you can, or let us say it is a formula that you can use to analyze any kind of narrative. So, this is how they proposed. This is one example from their own study. This is a narrative, this is a output from one of the participants. They are talking about a particular event, and this is the narrative, and then they will analyze it in this way. So, which are the clauses that are used? So, free clauses lines 1 to 3, narrative clauses then 4 to 5. So, basically what is the sequence? The free clauses sets the scene, the situation, the action, the characters, everything they talk about. Then comes the core action sequence, then comes the coordinate clauses we will talk about related to the preceding narrative clause, and then restricted, like they will either restrict its position in sequence, the words like either for example, and then the body of narrative. So, this is how they utilize, this is the formula they use to understand any kind of a narrative. So, Linde developed this particular approach for life stories. Based on this particular structure, he developed it further, focusing on coherence through causality, acceptable reasons for events, and then continuity. So, many scholars have of course depended on this, they utilized this particular format. So, Leboeuf and then Linde, both of them looked at the the componential analysis aspect. But there were some criticisms of their approach because it is less attention to the context, more attention to structure and less to context. That was one criticism. As a result, there has been a slight shift even in the modern day narrative genre analysis. Of course, we saw in the old times also there was a different focus on the context and the function and the performance. Similarly, in modern days as well, there is a shift to functional approach where we are looking at recent research moves from narrative as a text to narrative as a social practice. The many important names here, all these scholars are now looking at narrative as a social practice. How why do we use a narrative the way we do? So, this is this comes under the functional analysis. So, basically it examines the purposes, how narrators represent the world. Now, depending on who the narrator is, and this will change. So, who is the narrator, who is it narrated to, all of that will be part of the functional analysis. So, basically it asks, what does the story do? Fine, there is a story and it has a structure, but what is it doing? What is the purpose of the story? That is the primary point of departure for functional analysis. Similarly, Cheshire's framework is another interesting one where he looks at the gender aspect of language in case of narratives. So, he has this three important indicators: tale, teller, and telling. Tale is the story. So, what is the story all about? So, structured, he found out that depending on who is creating the story, the structure will be different. So, boys will structure their story, the tale, differently from the girls. Then the teller who is telling it, so represents self and others in a gender specific way, and then the telling, the final telling happens. So, how the story is told, used for different purposes by different gender. So, this is an example that he gives. Boys tell story in a groupy way with co-construction. So, as they go, they take the other people along. So, that is why it is a group group construction rather than an individual construction. And stories may be disorganized, but build group identity, emphasize social dynamics, storytelling as a tool for bonding, and so on. So, this is how boys speak. Girls on the other hand tell stories as an individual, not as a group. So, stories are coherent, structured and polished, focus on content and message, not on bonding. Story itself matters more than the act of telling. And then thereby he gives an example, he gives examples from boys, how they discuss and the way the girls talk about it. So, structurally the narratives from the genders differ. This is how his study looks at it. Then dynamic social practices. So, narratives should be understood as dynamic social practices. These are newer understanding rather than merely as structured texts. So, how stories are told? context and the Taylor identities. These are the focal points today. As we talk about genre analysis, narrative analysis, we are shifting more towards the social. So, how do you create an identity? What it is an action. It is not a static thing. It is a dynamic thing. You are creating something. So, how it is told, context, the person who is telling the story, all of them are important. So, identities are viewed as performed and socially constructed through interaction. That is how we understand it today, not as fixed attributes. So, if you are looking at only at the morphology, then you are looking at the fixed attributes, but if you are looking at narratives or genres of various kinds as a performance, then we will understand that this is dynamic. You can, it is a fluid kind of a scenario where you can create identities and social bonding as well through practicing that particular thing. So, here is a simplified comparison you can look up. I have put both the formal componential analysis and the functional analysis, and it is a kind of a comparison, simplified comparison you can look up. Some modern day genres that are being studied are these, for example, advertising, jokes, sermons, service encounter as well. So, this is a transactional communication genre. This has been studied extensively by Hassan. The format is called generic structure potential. Generic structure potential within the transactional domain. So, how this is also a genre, how the communication takes place, how the narrative is built up, and so on. So, systemic functional linguistics is also another way of looking at genres. So, this goes to the Sydney School, which was developed mainly from the theoretical work of Halliday. It was initially designed to address the needs of language and literary education in schools. Now, within this genre, the genres within this approach, genres are regarded as staged, goal oriented and purposeful social activities. So, there are a lot of overlaps between this and the previous structure that we talked about. So, genres within this approach is looked at as a social process that seeks to explain how texts achieve social purposes within the particular cultural and situational context. So, this is how Halliday described the context of situation. He labeled it as register, and these are the three core points that he talks about. So, the field, the tenor and the mode. So, field refers to what is happening, that is the ideational meta function. Tenor, the relations between participants, that is interpersonal meta function, and so he talks about his language meta function. So, ideational meta function, interpersonal meta function, and then textual meta function. So, based on this he gave his own theory. So, to sum up the genre analysis, we have seen that genres can be understood through both written and spoken. It can be texts, it can be spoken performances of various type. With academic lectures and even informal conversations can be part of genres. They can form different kinds of genres, and there are various differences, but most genres has share roles, goals and recognizable patterns. So, whichever genre it is, if it is informal setting or a formal setting, whether it is folklore or it is advertising, whatever, every genre has their a set of rules and set of goals and roles that they share within the genre they share. So, there are varied types, both written and spoken, and within each there are different types, and then we have this kind of, however, that is the binding principles are those. And then when we analyze genres, we have two main kinds, text first or context first. So, text first, we talk about those analysis where we talk about using morphology or strictly structural properties to analyze. On the other hand, be it functional, be it the Halliday's framework or be it Hassan's framework, there we are talking about context first approach, where we look at the analysis that starts with the social context where texts are produced and used rather than the other way around. So, this is where we complete this lecture. In the next lecture, we will take up another topic. Thank you.